Mary Beth Wiley, what past life experience of your own that you may or may not have shared with your auditor sticks out in your mind? Also, did you always have the same auditor? Are they assigned to you, or do you use an auditor that just happens to be available? I would love to hear stories from auditing sessions, as I am fascinated by the process. I guess I always assumed that auditing was more of a confessional for Scientology to use against its members. Also, does David Miscavige now, or did he ever receive auditing? Is he even considered clear or moving up the bridge? Okay, auditing experiences. Oh man, I had thousands of hours of auditing. So let's see here. Well, first off, let me address your question about David Miscavige. I think I've also answered, maybe since you've asked me this question, I might have had this come up on my show before, but no, he's not gotten any auditing since I think 1993 from the last reports we have. And he's supposed to be OT, gloritorious or something, but I have no idea where he's at on the bridge. But everybody in Scientology assumes that he's OT 8 or even higher, because if anybody would be assumed to have exposure to the upper OT levels, which by the way don't even exist, then Scientologists would assume David Miscavige does. That's how I used to think. I figured if anybody had read the OT 9 and 10 materials and was, prepped for that, it was David Miscavige. So that's kind of the assumption that's made in the Scientology world, but I had no idea when I was in Scientology that he had not had any auditing since 1993. This is not something Scientologists talk about, they just make assumptions. David Miscavige is not a person that people, at least not in any zone or sphere I was ever involved in, he is not the subject of a lot of conjecture about things. Okay. As far as auditing experiences go, it really, let your imagination run wild, and that's what you're going to find in auditing. Auditing is not just confessionals of your past sins. That is a specific kind of auditing called security checking. And that's not the most widely used form of auditing by a long shot. I've talked about objective processing, where you're walking around touching things and stuff. They do that stuff for hundreds of hours. It's not just like, go walk over to that wall and then, okay, you're done. They just go and go and go with that. And believe me, there's all kinds of trance induction and weird visions and stuff you're having when you're doing that. Kind of similar to certain drug trips, because the same kind of things are being tripped in your head when you're in a trance state. As far as my own personal experiences go, I don't know. I let my imagination really run wild. I had sessions where I talked about being an officer in a space fleet and destroying a planet by somehow shooting something down into the atmosphere that ignited the oxygen on the planet, right? So everything just, boom, it was gone, just like that. We had this some kind of a bomb or weapon that would do that. And it was instant, out goes, destroys all life, right? So that was, one thing I came up with. Another one was a rescue of somebody. I had this auditing session where I imagined that I was this is all in a past life, right? That I was some kind of a super paramedic, and I rescued some kid from a car that was falling off a bridge, and I had been kind of roped, and the car fell, and I grabbed the kid, and I was hanging by the rope. It was very heroic, and I'm sure it would make a great movie scene, but it was all just in my head, So, I don't know, those are a couple examples. Really, literally, the sky is the limit, your imagination. I also ran some things in auditing that I said I couldn't even describe easily in words, because the perception of it was so weird. Like odd colors, sort of, like those little toy tunnel things that we used to look in as kids, and they would show all these, sort of changing geometric shapes with rocks and a magnifying glass or something. I once had an auditing session where I imagined that was how I was perceiving the universe, and so I was sort of relaying the story of traveling through some, sort of not dimensional but weird tunnel, and it looked like that. I was drawing stuff up from anywhere I could, my imagination could find it, and telling my auditor this was what was happening, because I had been required in the auditing session to talk about an earlier similar incident to something that that had happened in my lifetime here on Earth. So maybe I, had some, and this is how most auditing works, is you address something from your present or relatively present time, some kind of problem you're having with, interpersonal relationship problem or a work problem or some kind of trauma or stress you've experienced, maybe an accident that you had, or it doesn't have to be a Dianetics type incident. It could just be an upset you have with somebody. And, maybe you had a fight with your boss or with your wife or with, your kid or something, and you're upset about it, and you're gonna address this in auditing. So the auditor gets you to talk about it. He checks a couple things on the e-meter as to whether, let's say it's a problem with the ARC triangle, right? I've done a video on this, so if you're curious what I'm talking about with the ARC triangle, check out my Basics of Scientology series where I explain it in detail. So maybe there's some upset, which means that there's a break in affinity, reality, or communication. You find out what it is, and then you look for an earlier time, and you look for an earlier time, and you look for an earlier time. And you keep going back earlier and earlier and talking about what happened. And if that doesn't provide enough relief and the needle on the e-meter isn't floating, which means it's moving gradually back and forth like this, if that hasn't happened, you got to go earlier. And you keep doing it until you go into past lives. And that's kind of the pattern of most auditing. There's other kinds of auditing processes and procedures. There's lots and lots of them. It's not a one procedure, one command type of thing. Hubbard developed hundreds, maybe thousands of different auditing commands and procedures. So when we talk about auditing, I talk about it in general terms because to try to communicate just one kind of process or one kind of procedure is a little difficult because there's so many of them. But the general idea with auditing is that that's what you're going earlier like that. So like I said, imagination is the limit, really. And I have heard some pretty wild stories auditing other people, and I came up with some pretty wild stories myself in being audited.